Ah, the good old Neo Geo, or as some people like to call it, the Neo Geo. This is the system that everybody wanted but nobody had, and if you did have one, you probably had a lot of friends wanting to come over to your house. But what does it even mean to own a Neo Geo, since it was originally an arcade machine? Well, there's a lot of options for collectors nowadays, but back in the day, it meant the people who owned the AES, which was the home console version. This sucker cost $650, and that was in the 90s, so it's even worse when you add in inflation. Most kids had either a Super Nintendo or a Sega Genesis back then, so asking your parents for an additional system that cost $650 would likely have them thinking you were crazy for requesting such a thing. But even if you did manage to get the system, the games were expensive too, costing anywhere from $100 to $300. So it was basically just a pipe dream for a lot of us who would have been interested. However, not all hope was lost, because these things were really popular in arcades and pretty easy to find. So if you had some quarters, you could play this thing for at least a little bit here and there. Which is what the majority of us did. I mean, this is how most people knew about Neo Geo, and the idea of the home console wouldn't have been so fascinating had gamers not been such huge fans of it at the arcade. Arcade owners were fans of the Neo Geo arcade machines as well, because not only were they good games people wanted to play, but they could swap out the games in each machine in the form of these massive cartridges. So, in a way, the arcade machines themselves were kind of like a home console with swappable cartridges. This made it easier for arcade owners to add games without having to purchase an additional arcade cabinet. It was called the MVS, which stands for Multi-Video System, because they could hold up to 6 cartridges depending on the machine. The most common one I remember seeing was the 4-slot model, but let me know which models you remember seeing the most. These MVS cartridges happen to be one of the most popular ways to collect Neo Geo games nowadays. This is because they are way more plentiful than the AES cartridges. Because Neo Geo was so popular in arcades, there were a ton of the MVS cartridges in circulation. And because arcades have mostly died out these days, those MVS cartridges needed to find a new home, and so you guessed it, those new homes were the homes of collectors. These cartridges are much different than your average game cartridges. Not only were they gigantic, absolutely dwarfing the size of other cartridges, they clearly weren't designed for consumers, with the labels having nothing on them except for very sterile text with the name of the game. This is because they were designed to be hiding inside of an arcade cabinet and only ever seen when an arcade owner would open up the machine to swap them out. Alright, at this point you may be thinking, how can you play these arcade cartridges at home? Well, there are a few options. Some people will actually buy the arcade cabinets themselves and have them in their home. You can also buy adapters so they'll work on the home consoles, or purchase custom consoles that have hardware taken from actual MVS units. Personally, that's the option I chose. I should also mention that there are various CD units made of the Neo Geo, but people often complain they're not as reliable and have slower loading times. So it depends how you feel about that sort of thing. Okay, but the games themselves, what makes them so special compared to anything else? Well, back in the 90s, fighting games were all the rage as a result of the Street Fighter II craze, and the Neo Geo had tons of great fighters. But it didn't just have great fighters, it had great arcade-style games. And these ranged from sports games, various types of shooters, running guns, and even puzzle games. Arcade-style games are just awesome because you can get a quick game in if you want to. And that's especially convenient for us older gamers who maybe don't have as much free time as we used to. Most of the games had 2-player modes, so the system could be a very fun experience with friends as well. The games were generally characterized by some pretty detailed 2D sprite work, huge sprites, and great animation. There was an extraordinary amount of care and precision put into the design of a lot of these games. Seriously, some of these games are like a work of art in motion. The games have aged really well and they are gonna look good forever. But they don't just look good, They also sound good with some punchy sound effects, really rounding out that arcade feel. Everything just feels so satisfyingly good to do in these games. For example, blasting away enemy soldiers in Metal Slug as they scream just never gets old. Alright, but what if you don't have piles of disposable cash to collect these games? Well, there's still a lot of ways you can play them. The games are available on a multitude of download services, as well as compilations that have a bunch of the more well-known games on them. And believe me, even the most hardcore Neo Geo fans will encourage you to play these games, even if you don't collect the original hardware. It's funny because this might actually be the most well-known console that nobody actually owned. And that's because in a lot of ways it really isn't a traditional console. I always think of it more like an arcade machine that had similar design features to consoles, with the main thing being the swappable cartridges. Think about it, more traditional consoles like the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were designed with the primary focus being the home consumer. The Neo Geo was designed to be a machine that would live in arcades. The home console variation was originally just meant to be rented out by video game stores, businesses, and special situations like that. It was only made available to the public due to high demand, but when I say high demand, we're not talking about 30 to 50 million units like the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. We're talking about the type of demand you see for a luxury item that targets a smaller number of consumers with pockets deep enough to afford it. And really, that's what the Neo Geo was. It was a high-end luxury product for the select few. There truly never was anything else like the Neo Geo, and there likely never will be, especially with the way that arcades have changed. Okay, so for this week's question, I want to ask you what your personal experience was with the Neo Geo back in the 90s. Did you play the arcade machines? Did you actually know somebody who owned the AES? Or perhaps it was something you only ever heard of but never saw. As always, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Oh, and also, I know that the difference between MVS and AES, as well as some of the other information presented here, can be confusing, so feel free to ask for further clarification in the comments, and I'm sure either myself or a fellow viewer will help you out. Alright, so go ahead and leave those comments and questions down below, and I will see ya in the next video.